orange are net importers of material resources. But when you actually look at the raw material trade balance, only Europe, which is in yellow, and North America, which is in green, are net importers. Asia and the Pacific, in orange, actually switches to becoming a net exporter of material resources. And that's driven by its very large export volumes of manufactured goods. Now, a similar picture also emerges when you look at physical trade balance and raw material trade balance by country income group. So you can see that high-income countries, which is shown at the far right, have a much larger positive trade balance when measured in embodied materials in trade, and these are the circles in yellow, than by direct trade, which are shown in the circles in blue. And the exact opposite is true for low-income countries. So this shows that when measuring embodied materials in trade, this accentuates patterns of unequal exchange, as the difference in resource use between developed and developing countries becomes much more pronounced. So it actually reveals that the high and ever-increasing dependence of affluent nations on the resource base and the manufacturing capacity of the rest of the world. It signifies the shift from resource-intensive processes from high-income importing countries to low and middle-income exporting countries. And importantly, that has a corresponding shift in the associated environmental burden of those processes, so of extraction. So looking a little bit more about the environmental impact of extraction, considering some other analysis of the International Resource Panel shows that over 90% of our global biodiversity loss and of our water stress, and about half of all our climate change impacts, are linked to the extraction and processing of resources. And so the extraction of resources for export, which is a large share of those resources, can significantly and adversely impact our natural environment. And if you look ahead, the fact that global resource extraction is set to double from the current 92 billion tons to 190 billion tons by 2060 under a business as usual scenario, this will very much exacerbate environmental pressures, threatening to surpass planetary boundaries. So an important finding of this study is this evidence that trade in many cases can shift the environmental burden from high-income importing countries to low-income exporting countries. And trade can accentuate these inequalities if environmental impacts are not fully accounted for in trading decisions. And this is particularly the case if trade boosts overall resource production and use, if it shifts production to countries with less stringent environmental legislation, and if it increases energy use and pollution linked to transportation. That said, with appropriate policies, trade can also have a very positive impact on the environment. For instance, if it permits extraction of resources and the production of commodities in locations where it's less burdensome on the environment. For example, where less energy needs to be used, less emissions are produced, or less waste is created. Equally, it can benefit the environment if it facilitates access, if trade facilitates access to green technologies and other environmental goods and services, or it creates opportunities for innovation. So from this analysis, given that the extraction, the processing, the use and disposal of material resources deeply affects the planet's climate, its environment and its resource base, urgent and very concerted action is needed. So addressing these environmental consequences of extraction and of trade will require nothing short of a global transition to more sustainable and more circular patterns of consumption and production. According to the International Resource Panel's analysis from its Global Resource Outlook, the adoption of resource efficiency and sustainable consumption and production measures could reduce global resource extraction by 25%. It could lower greenhouse gas emissions by 90%, and it could increase economic activity by 8% by 2060. So, a transition to circular economy is needed to reduce resource and energy demand and the accompanying environmental impacts of extraction. And I will now pass on to my colleague, Colette van der Ven, who will convey some of the policy messages of the report. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Christina. So following onto the overview that Christina just gave of the first part of the report, as she mentioned, the second part of the report focuses more specifically on what can be done given this situation, right? And in particular, what are the implications of enhancing and enabling such a transition towards a circular economy, which is being pushed quite a bit from the EU's side. And what are the implications of that for developing countries as well? And the importance of that you can see, or you can contextualize in what Christina just mentioned about how the resource burden is shifting towards developing countries, basically. So it's very important as we discuss what can be done in the current situation that the considerations for developing countries are not overlooked. Like with most things, they're both opportunities and challenges in this context. So I'm going to kind of walk through some of the key messages that came out of our report in these next couple of slides. So first of all, in this context, a really key element is trade. And why does trade matter when we talk about the circular economy? Trade matters because of global value chains. Production is no longer isolated. This has become increasingly integrated over the next, last 2-3 decades. And also because of end life, or products at the end of their life and what can be done with those. So that's also where it comes in. The extent to which a transition towards a circular economy will impact trade flows is quite uncertain yet, and we don't have enough data for a lot of different reasons. It also depends on the speed at which different countries will be adapting those principles, and a number of other elements. But there's a couple of areas that have been identified that will change trade flows between countries, or can be expected to do so. One is it can be expected to lead to a slower growth in trade in primary raw materials. Now, again, that needs to be caveated because this depends on demand. Demand depends in terms on population growth, standards of living that are rising across the world, things like that. And it also depends on the extent to which recycling and things like that could actually make up for or replace demand for virgin materials. So, but that's one trend that's been identified that we can and that we can see in the next, over the next couple of years. One element there for developing countries is that, as you can imagine, for resource-dependent developing countries, this could have significant repercussions and suggest that they would have to really diversify their economies in order to make up for any resource loss that will be associated with a potential reduction in demand on virgin materials. And this can be specifically dire for countries that have 80% of their exports comprised of one or two raw materials. Then there is an increased trade in secondary raw materials, secondhand goods for remanufacture. They kind of, they go hand in hand a little bit with the reduction in demand for primary raw materials. This again presents opportunities and challenges for developing countries. For example, take secondhand goods. On the one, we've all seen those pictures where you see different markets in different developing countries that are flooded with secondhand clothing, or the really bad quality secondhand cars that you would go into when you visit some African countries. Now, the issue with some of this is that on the one hand, it creates or could potentially undermine the local economy. It could also get a country stuck within lower levels of environmental regulations. So some of these older cars, for example, don't have the higher emission requirements that we have today. But on the other hand, increased trade in these products could provide access to some products that consumers may otherwise not have, such as in electronics and e-waste and things like that. And that again provides opportunities to develop industries around these areas. Relatedly, there will be shifting patterns in trade in waste and scrap for recycling. And again, there the story is opportunities and challenges. On the one hand, there's the waste dumping issue, where when it's difficult to differentiate between the types of products or waste that are coming in, we've seen that a lot of, especially developing countries without the capacity to recycle and engage in effective waste management, end up dumping a lot of that waste, right? So that is an issue that well, I'm hearing an echo. I don't know if anything changed in the videos. Well, I'll just continue. So on the other hand, the echo is still there. But on the other hand,
can we please mute? Thank you. I think you can continue. Sorry, Colette.
Thank you. No worries. Thanks, Francesca. On the other hand, this also creates opportunities, right? So developing countries can think about, well, how can we perhaps turn this waste into a commodity, right? And develop an industry around that and create employment and things like that. Then there is an anticipated shift in trade towards products meeting circular economy standards. So especially with large markets like the EU adopting increasingly stringent regulations on what a product should look like, how a product can ensure, or how to reduce any material inputs in the product and things like that. What we're going to see is that market access is going to be very much related to ensuring or being able to meet some of these higher product standards. So again, here challenges and opportunities. Challenges, especially for small businesses in developing countries that may not be able to meet those higher standards. Challenges because of a heterogeneity of the emergence of circular economy standards all over the world. Opportunities because it could nudge, products that are being imported or businesses importing products into markets like the EU to actually employ higher standards. And then finally, there is an emergence of trade in new services sectors. The circular economy relies a lot more on services. Linear economy, and I mean, not just with sharing services and platforms and things like that, but also vis-a-vis the types of services that would go into, for example, developing a competitive recycling industry or eco-design services or things like that. So it can really, impacts a potentially broad array of different services, and that again creates opportunities as well. So next slide, please. So now with having, as I mentioned, it's not quite clear exactly how these trade flows will play out within the next decade, but these are some anticipated changes. Now, what does this mean for trade policy? What does this mean for actions that countries can take to either enhance some of these or leverage some of these opportunities and mitigate some of these invariable, in challenges that will invariably arise? In the report, we look at this mostly from a regional trade agreements perspective, as well as what the World Trade Organization can do. But that all within keeping in mind that a lot of this starts at the domestic level. So one of our recommendations is that the domestic policies of a country must be aligned with what gets, or with a regional trade agreement, as well as what's being negotiated and discussed at the World Trade Organization. So there's an alignment element that we stress a lot in what should be done in this regard. Next slide, please. So turning first to the regional trade agreement element and then moving on quickly to the WTO element. So what is the role of regional trade agreements here as enablers for the circular economy with a focus on developing countries? Now, there are two different ways of looking at this. One is looking at provisions in regional trade agreements that are directly relevant to elements of the circular economy, right? So either provisions that mention the term circular economy or provisions that actually relate one way or the other to things like waste management, recycling, etc. And then there is a second way, and that is looking at it by focusing on provisions that don't directly mention the circular economy or waste management, but that are more substantive and can be actually used towards advancing the circular economy agenda in a different way. So towards the first way in which this can be done, here you see on the slide, this is a graph that comes from an OECD report that recently came out on aligning the circular economy with policies as well. And there, research was done about regional trade agreements that were adopted, and from the 730 regional trade agreements that were adopted until up to 2018, 335 contain provisions relevant in one way or the other to some sort of circular economy action. So those are not provisions that directly mention circular economy. Those are provisions mostly that mention either the Basel Convention, implementation of that, or that relate to things like natural resources. You've got a lot of provisions that mention the exception clause, Article 20, and provide policy space for countries to adopt certain measures relevant to natural resource protection. Some provisions that deal with prohibitions on trade in hazardous waste and things like that. So that's kind of the lay of the land there. Next slide, please. But turning to the second part, which I mentioned, so ways in which trade agreements can be leveraged through different non-specific provisions. There are a number of different ways in which this can happen, and the report also highlights that. So number one is that countries can strategically negotiate market access. So this concerns how tariff liberalization negotiations can align with circular economy objectives. For example, countries can opt to liberalize tariffs on things they would need to build a competitive recycling industry, such as, for instance, machinery for waste processing, or materials needed for eco-design, or products that use materials alternative to some of the materials that we don't want, right? Like alternatives to plastics, for instance, or things like that. Then also with respect to services, as goods and services are very closely linked in some of these market access commitments or in the services scheduling, countries are have an opportunity to align their needs with services they need, and they may need services in waste management and eco-design and things like that. It's very difficult to build up these technologies without the relevant services. So then trade agreements can be used to control circular economy related inputs. So this here we're talking about how can you ensure that if you want to build, for example, a competitive recycling industry, you get the kind of waste that is easy to recycle, and you don't get the hazardous waste, and you don't get the waste that is difficult to recycle, right? So how can you ensure that you regulate a little bit what's coming in and what's staying out? Then there's the heterogeneity of standards, which I mentioned in the previous slide. There are some developments at the ISO, the International Standards Organization level, to work on developing an international standard or standards on elements relevant to the circular economy, both upstream and downstream. But that's still a process. And what you see emerging in the meantime is a lot of different countries and businesses that develop their own standards, which could create a problem. So trade agreements, specifically under the technical barriers to trade part of the agreements, could ensure or nudge countries to harmonize with relevant international standards in this regard, and thereby facilitate trade in the types of products that we want to trade in. And then other provisions can be leveraged too, like subsidies, investment procurement, which I won't go into in detail in the interest of time. Next slide, please. I wanted to give an example of, the report focuses a lot on aligning circular economy objectives with trade agreements and kind of doing that strategically. And I wanted to give an example based on the previous slide on what this could look like. So say that a developing country wants to develop a regional recycling hub, say for plastics. Now, what are the three key ways in which trade agreements can be leveraged? One would be ensure recycled inputs of adequate quality, right? So that's what I mentioned about the input. Now, what's the trade implication here? There we're looking at the Basel Convention as well as trade agreements, right? And the Basel Convention that enables countries to trade in certain types of, easy to recycle plastic, but for based on the recent amendment, the plastics amendment, for hard to recycle or difficult to recycle plastic, you need prior and informed consent, right? So what does this mean vis-a-vis trade agreements, and how can this be aligned? Because one could be potential quantity restriction, which is often regulated under trade agreements, right? So this is a question. This is where work needs to be done, right, to really make this become a reality. Likewise, how can customs facilitation structures be up to the task to actually make some of these differentiations, especially because currently there's a bit of a misalignment between the harmonized system and the classifications therein, and the way in which the Basel Convention is differentiating between different types of products. So that's one area where, if you want to link all these elements, work can be done. Another area is developing waste management infrastructure capacity, as I mentioned in the previous slide. So here we're talking about strategically getting the types of services access for direct investment, as well as product inputs like, say, containers and things like that, to actually build this up. And there is a big role for technical assistance to do so under trade agreements, as well as including the World Trade Organization. to ensure that developing countries have the capacity. And then thirdly, create export markets for recycled, for example, products and materials. So if a country wants to develop different types of products, or export recycled waste, or produce products including that recycled waste, trade agreements can be leveraged to create export markets for that as well. And again, here we're looking at tariffs and non-tariff barriers, and this links to product standards as well. Next slide, please. So that's a snapshot of some of our recommendations on regional trade agreements and how those can be proactively utilized. Now there's the World Trade Organization as well, and there are a couple of action items or action strategies that can be adopted in that context. So the WTO has been doing a lot of work on transparency and cooperation functions, especially encouraging and or requiring countries to be transparent about the types of, for example, technical regulations they're adopting, including those with an environmental objective. So these provisions can be expanded upon to ensure that there is a dialogue happening at the multilateral level between what different countries are doing and how they can do it in a way that it advances circular economy and environmental objectives while minimizing any trade friction. The second one would be advocating for a statement focused on advancing circular economy sustainability as a priority area in the 12th Ministerial Conference that's coming up at the end of the year. There is a statement already that was launched, structured discussions on trade and the environment in November, which seems to be a good starting point for this, with quite a bit of interest from a large number of members in thinking about what more can happen or can be done in the trade system. The WTO can also be used as a convening platform to advance specific circular economy related issues. So we're talking very broadly here in this discussion about circular economy, but of course it looks very different for different materials, plastics and e-waste and scrap and metal and everything else. So it's very important for this discussion to become concrete, to get into the specifics. What kind of waste, what kind of plastic waste, what kind of polymers, right? What kind of issues, who's doing what? So, and what can be done there for the trade system. So that is an important discussion to be advanced, and there could be some work done in that context to align the HS classification issue with what's happening under international agreements such as the Basel Convention. And then finally, aid for trade, which is very important in this entire discussion, in particular to ensure that these initiatives are not leaving developing countries behind and making it more difficult for them to build up their economies in a sustainable manner. Thank you.
Thank you both Christina and Colette for your interesting presentation, which apparently already triggers many questions, as you can see in the